talk called 15 years, a century 15 years, and it was about 15 years of the creative writing course, and I credited every single person who had ever taught for the course, and several of the students that came out of the course, so the love was spread big time.
Apart from you, I don't think I've ever heard anybody mention Zoe Wickham and Margaret Alphys.
Margaret, and they stepped back as a result of, and there's a story about sex, gender, and class, because Jim and Alasdair and Tom, as working class men, Glaswegians of a particular generation, and Alasdair's always had helpers and secretaries, so Alasdair couldn't understand, you know, somebody with mobile phones and kind of doing stuff on their own, and with some women who'd be called middle-aged, some of them are middle class, some were not middle class at all. I found the most fascinating letter yesterday, and I really don't know if we're on yet, are we actually? We are. Well, I won't say too much about this, but I found a letter from a student who was registered at Strathclyde. I won't, so it'll remain utterly anonymous. I found a letter from a student copied to me about the course, a Strathclyde student, dated I think 2004 or something, and it was just revelatory, and I found it by accident looking for something else, looking for correspondence from Alasdair, just a few hours after I'd been speaking to Jenny Renton about the creative writing course, and it encapsulated and crystallised a lot of what I'd been saying about the I suppose just the separation of the course between Strathclyde and Glasgow, and the different approaches to writing, to tutoring, and so on. If I mean, you can edit this anyway, and I won't name any names, but because one of the tutors on the course had refused to write a reference for a student on the basis that, you know, their work was apt, if you like, and they also had issues with the Arts Council, Scottish Arts Council, which is half surprising.
Nobody will ever be able to work out who was
so they wouldn't write a letter on behalf of a student, but the student who was a working class, mature student, who just felt it wasn't acceptable to be doing the job and not do, and that's part of the job, you do the reference. I think I'd written the reference in the end, but it was interesting just to read that, and the truth is it's a bag of nettles, but a lot of complexities. It's not a simple story, so I really enjoyed talking about the creative writing, the emergence of the creative writing course in 1995 with Philip Hobsbawm, because it's such a great story, and there's so many angles to it and so on, and so many different perspectives, and even that letter, which was a letter of departure because the student was leaving the course, and a letter of complaint in a way, even that had in it all kinds of positives, and so you couldn't, if you just looked at that letter, you couldn't take it. It's one thing, but I'll tell you a funny Alasdair story that you like. When Alasdair was asked many years ago, this might have been before, I think it's quite possibly before he came to teach. I mean, obviously Alasdair taught as a creative writing fellow at Glasgow and Strathclyde, but this was before the three professors.
Hold on, he taught as a creative writing fellow at Strathclyde as well?
As far as I'm aware. I might be wrong about that, but as far as I'm aware, I could be wrong, because I could, so don't quote me on that. I might be wrong about that. He'd been a creative writing fellow. I know Tom Leonard, I thought the same thing was there at Strathclyde.
There was a Keith Wright writing residency that went round for decades. Bernard did
he didn't do it. Gallagher didn't do it, you're saying?
Not that I know of, but
that's
there's hidden histories there.
Well, there might be a hidden history there.
I think Nigel would know.
Nigel would know, and we'll ask Nigel. So I'll backtrack a bit. But Alasdair was asked sometime in the late 90s, I believe, Zoe Wickham knows this story well, if he would examine some papers for students, look at some creative writing work, for which he would be paid. And Alasdair wrote a letter of reply to the university, and then I heard back, that people at the university were in recovery, or they were in rehab, everybody was shocked, people had fainted, like 2 deaths were reported and so on, because of this letter that Alasdair wrote. It was, have you ever seen such cruelty and so on? And I thought, I'd like to see this letter. So I managed to track the letter down, and the letter was vintage Alasdair, because what it said was, you have asked me to mark X number of papers and you are paying me Y amount of money. Given the time and care I would spend on these papers, academics aren't allowed to say this, that is, tuppence an hour, and I'm not going to work at those rates, because he was saying to do this job properly, and been massively underpaid. Well, this is what our graduate teaching assistants know in every university, that it's about exploitation, but Alasdair wasn't having it. But it was the most polite, courteous. I said at the time, I said, God, these people need to get out more. if this caused ructions at Strathclyde University.
Just simply pointing out.
Exactly, but he pointed out a fact, he was stating factuals, and actually stating them in a kind of a Alasdair arch, kind of a one eyebrow raised way. Utterly reasonable, and yet these people, obviously whoever it was, never been spoken to in that manner, and was stunned by it. But I suppose that encapsulates differences between what people think is how people are valued and how certain kinds of work are valued.
And there's no doubt that the kind of responses that Alasdair would get to his letters would often be largely dictated by, was this somebody who was reading the letter who already respected him and was already looking to view him in a generous way or a charitable way, or to think the best of him, or is this somebody that was coming to him cold and who might react because that sort of directness, even if put in his respectful way, might be offensive to some people. I typed loads of letters like that in my time, loads and loads and loads.
So maybe tone, irony, that kind of thing. Although even then, when I looked, because I thought, I mean, sometimes what you're saying is not what somebody receives. And I had that once with a creative writing student who didn't get something they thought they might get, and they wrote to me, and I wrote back what I thought was a very sympathetic, but it was blunter than I meant it to be because it was done in a hurry, so it didn't have my usual kind of qualifications, and they were in tears, they were upset because they thought I was unsympathetic, which I wasn't at all. But Alasdair's letter, I mean, I couldn't for the life of me see how it would upset anybody. It was just a statement of fact, but that's how touchy university administrations were.
And I'm guessing that he wouldn't have said anything that kind of referred to his own standing at all. It would just be, you would never get that. Because by the late 90s you could go, I'm the author of these books, I've done all of this, and you want me to do what now? But he never had any of that about it.
It was just purely about the time the task would take to look at these. I remember one time when I taught at Goldsmiths in 1992-93, I had 50 10,000 word creative dissertations to mark, creative writing dissertation to mark, and 50 times 10,000 words, you do the math, was a lot of math, but that's and that was some,
math for me to
and
do.
quite often you were doing that plus all the other marking you had. So I mean, creative writing was notorious. There was a study done a few years ago by the Subject Association to state the obvious and say that creative writing teaching differed from all other kinds of teaching for the simple reason that nobody really gave a fuck about Shakespeare. They weren't umbilically linked to it. It wasn't about their mother or their father and so on. So they weren't attached to it. Whereas with creative writing, it very often was stories they felt visceral about, that they were linked to and so on. So first of all, the relationship with students to their work is completely different in creative writing. And then also the work involved in mentoring, nurturing, supporting writers is completely different from somebody, as I say, who no matter how much they like James Joyce, they're not going to, that's not their, might not see that as the future or whatever, so it's a different
different thing. It seems more akin to like art school and some of the like fine
I'm sure it absolutely does.
Similar kind of approach. Can you go back to when you first arrived, Willy? You were talking about your first time you met like Philip, and that's first time you then were connected to Alasdair and that kind of network. Can you talk a little bit about that time? You're talking a wee bit about Rubaiyat, the kind of whole kind of
because I told the story of that's a story of how Philip encountered at Alasdair, because Philip used to hold forth in the Rubaiyat in Speirs Road, which where a lot of academics went to. That was a kind of hub. And I think the story is that Alasdair went in there and Philip listened to Alasdair. I mean, Philip could talk a lot and recycle rooms of all kinds of poets. And Philip knew an awful lot and he was open to everything. So Philip would never say, oh wait a minute, that's one of these American novels about basketball or baseball, I'm not interested in it. He was interested in everything, and whatever people were writing, he knew what the best books in that genre were and so on. Anyway, and Alasdair had the same eclectic encyclopedic knowledge of literature of all different kinds and wasn't a snob. So, and it's like Brecht on football or James Joyce on the music hall. They are inclusive in their attitude to popular culture, which some people aren't.
Are you about to say that Philip couldn't get a word in, just had to listen to
Philip listened to Alasdair for a while, and then he said, people would pay to listen to your discourse. because he was so impressed with Alasdair and Alasdair's discourse.
What year are we in here?
That's very interesting because I think that might have been pre-Lanark, so that might have been, maybe there was, I mean Lanark was in progress for 30 years, but I think that might have been 79, late 70s sometimes 78 or 79, I think it was prior to Lanark appearing. Obviously Alasdair was known down in Glasgow, and Philip had did work with a lot of writers and was working with writers then, like James Kelman and others in Liz Lochhead. But so that's just one story. I mean, to think back to my first encounter with Alasdair, it's difficult to remember exactly what year that would be, but I wrote to Alasdair something about literary theory, and Alasdair wrote back and said, I'm not interested in any of these isms, because he just thought Marxism, postmodernism or whatever it was. I didn't bother to write back and say deconstruction ism. It's not really an ism, but that was my interest at the time. But I don't know what else to say about that.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, okay. So I think then I would think, how much did contact did I have with Alasdair after that? I mean, I've got some letters and so on that he was writing, even earlier than because where was it before? It was Curzon Street, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Was it Curzon? Yeah, I got
that's photos from Curzon Street.
Yeah, I mean, I was never there, I was never particularly close or there. And then I taught the work, so I taught things like History Maker, and I taught Poor Things.
How early were you teaching those, do you think?
Well, probably, I mean, 94, 95.
Right.
Maybe 95. In fact, in 1998, I went to Cleveland, Ohio for a semester. There was a brilliant student there who was working on Poor Things, doing a big project on it with a dissertation. And she was interested in Alasdair's visual art, but also obviously the fiction. But I would be teaching Alasdair's text for from 94, certainly for the time I was at Glasgow, 30 years ago.
We're about to start teaching Poor Things again into first years at Strathclyde.
Great.
I'd be really interested to know how you used to do that.
Oh yeah.
And I feel like we were talking about that too. I know Lanark is the only set text at secondary school level, but it's for it's like a advanced higher. So that's, I mean, there's parts of his work that fits in different parts of, like there's a short story that appears in biography section in different places, but we're saying that Poor Things should be the text.
Poor Things is the one. I think it's brilliant.
It is.
It's perfect. It's perfect for now. I mean, it's so, and obviously with the film. The thing is, I wrote an essay on Poor Things called 50 Shades of Grey for the Edinburgh Review, which is not digitised, so it's hard to come by. But I put it on ResearchGate, which is a kind of public site for academics. And I noticed it seems to have had a few kind of reads lately. But when I started off doing the blog that I did about Poor Things, the film, I was originally going to just do a version of my article, and then I just did something about the film, about the reception of the film. But as I say, I gave a lecture on Poor Things, and this is my, and when I stopped lecturing on it, I wrote it as an essay.
Yeah.
So in terms of how you would do it. And I did it through looking at the Alison Lumsden essay, which is really about how it's a feminist socialist text, so it can't really be postmodern, because postmodernism is more experimental, and that, which I think was not right in terms of what experimental writing can do and whether or not it can be political. And Alasdair's book manages to be both.
Yeah.
Social surrealism, if you like, saying the Urban Welsh. So I did that, had that lecture, and it was a writing and text course. It was about how novels are made up of lots of different pieces of discourse and different pieces of text, and Poor Things was absolutely perfect for that. So as I say, that lecture became an essay, and that essay was for the Edinburgh Review, but the Edinburgh Review isn't digitised, so it's hard to hold off.
Well, we've got a digital project that we made last year all about Poor Things, because when we knew it wasn't going to be filmed.
Well, I've got a PDF.
Yeah.
I'd love to read it as well.
I'll send the PDF to two of you then.
Yeah.
So I'm about to write 5 lectures on Poor Things from scratch.
So I'll send you mine.
That's my starting point. I'd love to know the way
that
you did it. Also because the world has changed around us so radically since it.
Well, I did it in a nice way because I happened to have lectured on Henry James and on Thomas Hardy. So I did it as a kind of Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Henry James hated that novel and thought it was chock full of falsities because it was about a woman who was raped and went to the gallows, and it was one of those sad news stories. Lots of male writers at the time were writing about women, and the little puppet Muppet women went through hard times and bad things happened to them, and it was the only way you could talk about social class. You couldn't talk about class except through the Muppet puppet women that you had. So many novels of that period Dostoevsky in Notes from Underground turned it upside down and subverted it, but everybody else was just playing with the woman who falls in hard times and ends up, you know, the guillotine or the gallows or the prison or whatever, or the ditch. And Henry James hated that model and wanted to write about people who affronted their destiny, defied their destiny, and didn't allow their lives to be written by men and controlled by men in that way. And he did that magnificently in several books, including Portrait of a Lady. So he was against that. So, so I started off talking about that model of men writing about social class through women, because you couldn't do it in other ways, class and gender. And that led me into Alasdair writing something really of that period, and in that style. They used to call it the rescued women narrative, although very often they weren't rescued at all. But looking at that as a kind of as a model and the different ways of doing it, and how Alasdair did it, which was almost to do a kind of a Tess story and then a kind of a redemption story, or actually Bella doesn't accept the story that's been told. So, which obviously the film took away, but in the lecture I have that. So it was really nice to do the different frames and then think about the history of that model of writing, of men writing about social class and poverty in the only safe way. A bit like the way it works now, where we don't want to see, if we're racist, male adult immigrants. We want to talk about the women and children and so on and so forth. The code at that time was, we want to talk about poverty and social class, but we can't feel sorry for the minors. You know, but let's pity the poor women. So I think that story and the idea of affronting your destiny was something Alasdair was very aware of. So that was my pitch.
I didn't know that about James and Portrait of a Lady, but I'm really interested in the idea of, you know, new creative work coming out of something that bothers you in old creative work. You know, and that being a kind of a charge, if you like, for the story that you want to see made. I always remember that Alice used to say, if you can think of something that doesn't exist,
and
make it imagine.
Now, I don't know if Alasdair ever read Theodore Dreiser, because Theodore Dreiser wrote many novels. He was from a huge family. He was a communist, American communist, early 20th century, and he wrote a book called Sister Carrie, and Sister Carrie is one of these stories about the poor woman that comes to the big city, is taken up by one man, taken up by another man, and so on. But the actual cycle of the story is she outlives them, she survives them, she steps in their heads to get somewhere else, and she becomes a performer, an actor, because what she performs is a version of femininity that she's been taught by these men who have told her this is how women walk, this is how women dress. So it's a really interesting story. It's totally the, what do you call it, a construction of a version of women, as it were. But that's an affronting destiny story. I wouldn't do a spoiler, but it ends in a way that shows very significantly the decline of the men and the rise of the same as Poor Things. Same as Poor Things. So it's about that.
When was that published?
And I think that was published in about 1917. It might be 1919. But it's an absolutely brilliant. I recommend it to people all the time. It's got some of the most incredible descriptions of social class in it. It's actually got one that Alasdair, I know, would have loved, which is when Carrie, who's this poor background, but is getting on thanks to these men giving her the hands up because of her appearance. And at a certain point she sees men, mill workers, as kind of ghosts because they're covered in flour and so on, and it makes her think of her father. And she then talks about how people looking at her as a working class woman who's well dressed wouldn't see the social class in her, yet she knows that she's sucked up from the same roots as these working class men. So it's a really interesting story about social mobility, and about the female working class, the daughters of working class, daughters of the working class, and how they kind of, as it were, ascend or escape, but how they carry with them all of that, all of those markers. There's also another beautiful moment in it where she meets, first of all, this salesman. I'll be very brief. She meets a salesman, and the salesman's, you know, he's sharp, he wears a fancy suit, he's got shiny shoes, and she's sitting on a train with him. It's set in 1900, 1899, 1900, beginning of all the big department stores and all that, and the beginnings of celebrity in magazines. But she's sitting on a train with this this salesman with his shiny shoes, patent leather shoes, and his fancy suit. But there's another man she sees who's a bar manager, who's better off, and she starts to compare their clothes, and it really is the most, because clothes speak in the novel. It's a bit surreal. The clothes start to speak, and she begins to see that the matte leather shoes of the richer man are of a better quality, and she begins to check out the clothes, and entirely through the semiotics of clothes, she works out who the social class is through the differences. The ostentatious, shiny suit Spiv guy that she's with is not a patch on this. So it's really, so all of that, as I say, social class being analysed and worked through a male author's depiction of a woman's plight, if you like. And that was a common thing. It was done in all kinds of different ways. The first subverter of it was Dostoevsky, I think, with Notes from Underground, which capsized the whole narrative.
Which Alasdair definitely knew.
Yeah, Alasdair knew that well, and there was other but Henry James was the see, now people I know people would say, I've read Tessa d'Urberville's, it's wonderful, Harvey's fantastic, I've read Henry James, Portrait of a Lady and so on, and he's fantastic, but that was James's line on Tess, was it was chock full of falsities, and he hated it. And that was the opening of my lecture.
Brilliant.
So when you're talking about representations of working class women in particular, did you teach, or do you know a lot about like Agnes Owen's work as well?
Well, I'll tell you about Agnes. So Agnes Owen's, I mean, if I was to say something critical, I would say, different from Tom, Jim and Alasdair weren't wonderful mentors or supporters of writers in general. Agnes Owen stands out as somebody they picked, in other words, they weren't, and nor were they always generous to women writers in general, but I suppose Janice Galloway would disagree, Neil Locke would disagree, Janice Galloway certainly would disagree. But
Janice would disagree that Jim and Tom weren't.
I think she would, I don't know, because I think she was first, she early on, I think, supported the writing of Irving Welsh and so on. But in terms of supporting writers generally, general support of writers, I mean, Alasdair used to write saying to people that wanted to come to read stuff, essentially, I'm busy, or words to that effect. But
well, he would specify.
He'd specify.
I support Agnes Owens because she's an ignored working class woman
who's
a cleaner.
But it was an exception.
So
it wasn't. She was an exception.
To get out of.
It was a get out of jail card for that, and that's the first thing I'll say is she was an exception. She was the exception. Just as James Joyce wasn't supportive of other writers, but Yeats was hugely supportive. Everybody's different and for different reasons. Sometimes it's their own background and so on. So I would say Agnes Owens is the exception. Obviously, they did the Lean Tales and all that. But I was once summoned to the office of the principal at the University of Glasgow on my 50th birthday. I was summoned because I'd been cheeky in public a lot. I'd put my head so far above the parapet, it was on the flagpole. It was my 50th birthday. I'd just got my bill screening thing through, and I turned up at 9 o'clock on Friday morning, and they said, "How are you?" And I said, "Well, I've just had my bill screening through the post, and it's my birthday, and here I am to be seen getting seen." But then before I left, I told the principal 2 stories. One was about James Kelman's bus conductor Hines. So I said to him, in the bus conductor Hines, you know, Rab Hines is the blue collar worker, bus conductor, and if he does a minute overtime